Okay, so hello everybody, we are back, and today we'd like to introduce you to Dr. Bridget Deemer. Now we see her as a child with her sister Rachel and her cousin Abram. A characteristic of her is that she's always smiling. Here we see Bridget dancing with her grandfather in the kitchen. Try to teach him some ballroom dancing. On this slide, we see Bridget and her partner Mike on a walk in the mountains. Of course, their dog Bandit is also with them. Here we see the family from Bridget's mother's side during summer vacation in coastal Maine, where her aunt and uncle live.
She calls herself a limnologist and a biogeochemist. Here you can see the biogases she works with. Here is Mrs. Deemer smiling ear to ear. The photo was taken on the day she defended her Ph.D. The photo was taken at the Washington University. Here she is on the Lake Powell in Arizona. We see her taking water samples for long-term water quality monitoring, where she is still working today. We see her on the Lacamas Lake, which is in Washington. This is where she spent most of her time for her thesis. She is dragging an instrument across the lake. Here we see them on Buyatama Lake in Iceland. You see them performing a flow chamber incubation.
Now we come to her favorite activities besides work. She loves hiking, whether together with her dog Bandit or her husband or even both together. In this picture she is in the Utah Canyon lands with her loving Bandit and partner. As you can see, everyone is having fun. Just like on this photo, she is out hiking with a friend in British Columbia to the top of the Neve. All three are grinning and enjoying the view from above. Another hobby is boogie boarding. She likes this activity on the beach and does it whenever possible. She enjoys being in the water and having fun at the beach. A walk with her lovely dog Bandit is also something she likes to do. She does a lot with her Bandit. She walks with him through the woods or goes hiking with him. He brings a lot of positive energy into her life. She enjoys spending time with friends, eating and laughing with them. Dinner is always a good way to spend time with people you love, like family and friends, and this is what she likes to do. This cute animal that sleeps here on the sofa is her cat Cinnamon. She is a very cuddly cat and likes to lie on the sofa with her owner in the evening and watch TV with them. She loves to cuddle and always lies in strange positions. A funny story is that last year she had the chance to travel to Australia for work, and there she met a lot of quokkas. These are little marsupials found in Australia. In this picture she's randomly made a selfie with a quokka. The animal seems to be as happy as she is. So that was our little introduction of Bridget Deemer, and have fun with the further presentation.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me here, to the organizers and also to that awesome introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be part of what's been so far a really stimulating conversation. So today I'm going to be talking about my work on lakes and reservoirs to try to understand patterns and controls on methane emissions, and also to try to better constrain the magnitude of these emissions from aquatic ecosystems. And so, as Silk mentioned yesterday, a lot of times when people hear the word methane, they think of cows.
Can I go now?
Really? That was rude, sir.
Okay, we gotta go, babe. Gotta go. Gotta go. Love you. Bye.
So digestion in the guts of cows and other ruminants is an important source of methane, and it's gained a lot of attention in the popular media just because it's, I think, pretty relatable and easy to understand. Methane is produced kind of ubiquitously across a number of environments, so it can also be produced in our guts. About 10% of people are methane breathers, and that included myself the last time I checked with our autoanalyzer. But it also occurs in the sediments of lakes and reservoirs and streams and other aquatic ecosystems. So today I'm going to go through a little bit of background about aquatic methane emissions and global methane emissions and why we should care. Then I'm going to talk about the work that I did as the last chapter of my Ph.D. to synthesize methane emissions from artificial human-created reservoirs. Then I'll touch on some challenges with upscaling methane emissions sort of more broadly across multiple aquatic ecosystems. And then I'd like to spend some time just talking about opportunities for identifying possible management solutions in some different types of systems, which I know is a topic of the CHARM project here, and which I think is a really important way for scientists to start to think about how their research can matter for ecosystem management. So this is a plot that was compiled as part of the National Climate Assessment Global Change Research Program analysis that's just showing atmospheric concentrations of 3 of the most important greenhouse gases over time. And I think the thing to take away from this plot is just that of all 3 of these gases, methane has increased the most since the Industrial Revolution. So this is nearly a 3-fold increase since the mid-1700s. And although this gas isn't the dominant gas on a concentration basis, it's really, really potent in the atmosphere. So on a 100-year time scale, it's about 34 times more potent than CO2. And that makes it somewhere between 16 and 25% contributor to the greenhouse gas effect at this point in time. So this is just a pie chart from the most recent global methane budget that was done. And on the left you have some dominant anthropogenic sources of methane, including that cow that we saw earlier. So when we think about concentrations increasing in the atmosphere, we can think about a lot of these anthropogenic activities which have really accelerated over time. But I think it's important not to forget that we've also been experiencing extreme dynamism in sort of our aquatic resource pool. So this was a really cool study that came out a couple of years ago that used satellite information to look at changes in the aquatic terrestrial surface cover of different aquatic systems and documented new pools of water and lost pools of water across the globe. And what they found is that between 1984 and 2015, we lost an area of freshwater about the size of Lake Superior, but we gained area elsewhere, about double that surface area. So just thinking about kind of what this means for our aquatic ecosystem services and processes, I think is really interesting. And that brings us to the interest in how methane emissions might be changing in some of these aquatic ecosystems. And particularly in this talk, I'll mostly focus on lakes and on artificial reservoirs, which I think is an interesting kind of intermediary between thinking about these anthropogenic emissions and natural emissions, just in that these artificial reservoirs and other sorts of artificial water bodies are human created, but they also share some characteristics with natural ecosystems as well. So why are aquatic ecosystems important methane sources? It's important to remember, I'm not going to touch on it a ton in this talk, but when we think about methane emissions, we're actually talking about a balance between two microbial processes. The process of methane production, which we also refer to as methanogenesis, and the process of methane consumption, which we refer to as methanotrophy. Methane producers, we heard from Karina about a process where methane can be released in surface waters that are oxygenated, but that's really not the dominant pathway for methane release. Most methanogens are functioning in really reducing conditions in the sediments where there's no oxygen available, and where other more preferential electron acceptors like nitrate and sulfate have already been consumed. There's also a fermentation pathway. High organic matter systems like lake sediments are a great place for them. And then there's also this paradigm where we tend to think about methane coming from fresher water than from saltier water. And one of the reasons for that is just that sulfate reduction is really preferential over methane production. Sulfate is a more thermodynamically favorable electron acceptor for microbes that can kind of switch pathways. Methane consumption tends to happen in a microaerophilic environment, so at sediment water interfaces, and also in regions of higher salinity. So all of these things sort of balanced against each other. There are many aquatic ecosystems that really favor this methane production pathway. And so here I have a little schema of an idealized lake, and for those of you that have been swimming in the summertime, you know that there's a warm upper surface layer, and then if you dive down deep, you get to a much colder region of water. We call this stratification. I'm probably talking to people that already know about this, but I just think it's important to go over because this differentiation between the surface layer and the bottom layer is really what leads us to conditions where oxygen can't be mixed downward. So we have heating of the surface that's happening faster than that heat can be mixed down. In comes nutrient loading from inlet waters, and together with sunlight promotes high rates of primary production, consumption of CO2 in the surface waters. But then as all of this production sinks down through the water column and is decomposed, the oxygen that used to be really prevalent in that cold bottom water gets consumed. And once that oxygen is consumed, microbes start to produce other greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide and methane as multiple electron acceptors are consumed out of the water column. For methane, there's a couple different pathways that can lead to its ultimate release. So at least during the summertime, that methane will get trapped in the hypolimnion, and there'll be really limited exchange with the surface water. But it turns out that methane is actually it doesn't like to stay in solution. It's not very soluble. And so in some ecosystems, a really important pathway can be this bubbling, which we also call ebullition, and which you guys nicely depicted on the coasters and the bags for this symposium. And this is just a video. I'm sure that any of you that have spent time on the lake have noticed bubbles. And sometimes those bubbles can be from fish disturbing sediments, the hydrogen sulfide. If you smell like a rotting egg smell, can also be a culprit, but a lot of times if the bubbles don't really have a smell to them, it's likely methane that you're seeing. This video was taken near one of our funnel traps that we use to collect methane bubbles in a reservoir in Oregon as part of my PhD work. And it was really just impressive to me how many of these bubbles were happening. This was at a time when the water level was dropping. And it was also really dramatic in that there were two inlets to this reservoir, one of them coming from a region where there was a dam upstream, and one coming from an undammed reach. And this video was taken near the undammed reach where you have more organic matter coming in, and then you go to the other side of the reservoir and there's very little bubbling happening on the dammed reach side. So just interesting and also extremely spatially heterogeneous in terms of trying to characterize these bubbles. Methods that we currently use to estimate methane emissions from aquatic ecosystems include some that are mainly focusing on that diffusive pathway. So gases dissolved in water, we measure a concentration of that gas in the water, we measure a concentration of the gas in the atmosphere, and then we use either models or measurements to estimate the piston velocity, K value, or the rate of exchange between the water and the air. And so all of those things together, we can estimate the flux. Other methods are capturing specifically bubbles, like this funnel trap in panel D, and like you saw in the video, where we literally have a funnel out that funnels bubbles into it, and then we can calculate a flux based on the surface area of that funnel and the number of bubbles, the amount of methane gas that's entered the funnel over time. And then we have sort of these integrative approaches like eddy flux in the upper right-hand corner, where we're actually measuring the rate of methane loss at the region above a reservoir and sort of integrating over a footprint. And then the floating chambers, like you saw me using on that little raft in Iceland, where we're just measuring the increasing concentration of gas or decreasing concentration over time. And there we either can back out diffusive flux as sort of a linear accumulation where we require like a high R² value, or we can use it to estimate both if we allow for incubations with large jumps. So you can really see when an ebullition event has happened, just because you get this like non-linear increase in methane over time. And so part of the uncertainty in our emission estimates has to do with these very different methods that produce really different results. So this is a plot modified from Schubert et al., where they went out and they measured methane emission on a single lake over time using 6 different methods. And what you can see is that the method that you use really matters, and that you get really different results depending. And in general, the pattern is that when we only measure diffusive emission, which are these thin boundary layer models, in the lower panel, we tend to get much lower emissions. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about a synthesis that I did of reservoir greenhouse gas emissions with a number of folks that had been studying greenhouse gas emissions in their respective systems at the time. And artificial reservoirs are often lumped with natural lakes. So even in talking about like my favorite reservoirs being Lacamas Lake and Lake Powell, you don't even hear the word reservoir in the name of the systems. I think people just like the idea of going to the lake more than the idea of this modified reservoir. But there's reason to think that these reservoir systems likely function quite differently than a lake would. So this is a picture of HfK+G Reservoir in the Yakima Irrigation District of Washington, so a little bit east of Seattle, Washington. This is during a drawdown period. that's done each winter to sort of make way for winter floods. And you can see this sort of forest field of tree stumps. So this reservoir was flooding this extremely organic rich landscape, and I think this is just a nice visual of that. So because of this, we might think that reservoirs would be disproportionately active with respect to methane generation, because they have this huge organic matter pool to begin with. And so throughout the rest of this talk, one of the themes will be just this idea of reservoirs as these really important and reactive systems that are affecting the carbon budget. And I think this is a nice video. I forgot to test this one. But let's see if it will work. Maybe not. Oh man, I forgot.
It's working.
Okay, awesome. So this is a visual depiction of our best global database of reservoirs so far. This is from Lerner et al. 2011, also known as hydro lakes. And basically it just shows that we've built quite a few reservoirs over time. And that these reservoirs were constructed to meet a number of really important human needs. But I think it's important to think about their unintended consequences as well. So this is over 6,000 of the world's largest reservoirs, but there's a lot of reservoirs that aren't included in this database or in mapping efforts just because they're too small, and we really don't have the technology when we take satellite data right now to differentiate a natural lake from an artificial reservoir. So up until the time of the synthesis work, people tended to think about age and latitude as the most important controls on reservoir emissions. So if you were in the tropics, you had more emission. If you were a younger system and your organic matter had just been flooded, you had more methane emission as well. This is from a review by Natan Barros and colleagues in 2011. But when I started doing my PhD work, we started to notice some pretty dramatic gradients. We had selected a series of reservoirs that crossed a trophic gradient to go out and measure methane emission. And we noticed that we were seeing a lot more methane emission in the eutrophic systems than in the oligotrophic ones. And there's good sort of functional reason to think that there would be more methane emission from systems with higher primary productivity. So in the wetland research, methane had been proposed as this master variable of methane emission back in the early 1990s. And there were a number of examples sort of at a more regional scale where more eutrophic lakes and reservoirs were emitting more methane or had higher methane concentrations than oligotrophic lakes in similar regions. And when you think about this, and you go back to the lake schema that I kind of talked through before, in a lower primary productivity situation, you have less organic matter sinking through the water column to be decomposed, so less oxygen demand, which means you have more oxygenated conditions at the sediment-water interface that can support more methane consumption, and that might lead to less methane production in the sediment. Whereas under this high primary productivity scenario, you have the perfect storm of reducing low oxygen conditions at the sediment-water interface, and then also abundant organic matter supply. So in going through the literature, we had a few questions. One of them is just what is our best estimate of greenhouse gas emissions from reservoirs. The most recent kind of overall estimate of greenhouse gas emissions had been done in the year 2000 and had used really outdated estimates of surface area. But then also if we should be considering methodology when modeling methane emissions, sort of for the reasons that I talked through before, that methodology can really matter. And then also if we could detect an effect of eutrophication when we zoom all the way out to the global scale. So this was a lot of reading and going through the literature to basically just go through every peer-reviewed study and compile estimates of emission and then any reported potential predictive variables. And this is a table of our results compared to results from a number of other studies, and I know there's a bunch of numbers up there. But the main thing I want to point out is just the results on the very top line. So what we found was that 80% of the greenhouse gas forcing from reservoirs in our synthesis was due to methane. So methane was the most important greenhouse gas. And it was the highest per area emission of any other aquatic system, the average aerial emissions that we reported. Turns out, not like a huge surprise, but methods did matter. So part of the reason for this much higher aerial emission rate that we estimated is that early on in the sort of compilation of these emission estimates, we decided to only include papers that measured both diffusive and ebullitive emission. And that's because of the results plotted right here. So what we see is that there's significant difference between studies that looked at diffusion only and then diffusive plus ebullitive. You get about over a doubling of the per area rate of emission. And the other thing that you can't really see in this slide, but that has been a theme throughout not just reservoir work, but work in lakes as well, is that the fraction of emission is really variable from system to system. And we don't have a good predictor variable that predicts what fraction of emission might be ebullitive versus diffusive. So you can't just take an ebullition only or a diffusion only estimate and then kind of back calculate what you think the whole rate is. You really need to be measuring both of the pathways in your individual system to get at a total magnitude of emission. So we went forward with our analysis just using this group of samples where we have emission estimates from both pathway. And I guess a thing to point out before talking through the rest of the results is just that I think this analysis was a really nice example of sort of geographic disparities when we think about like global scale controls. So this is a map of all of the reported methane emissions in reservoirs where the color and the shape of the point shows the pathway that was reported. And this is sort of like a reverse case where a lot of times a lot of ecological research is done in the northern latitudes, either in the US or Europe. But in this case, a lot of the early reservoir greenhouse gas work was done in Brazil, just because of all the questions around, you know, is hydropower really a green energy source? And in the Amazon basin, hydropower is a really big source of energy for them. Whereas a lot of the work that was done in the northern latitudes was done as part of Hydropower Quebec, or sort of just as an ancillary measurement in a larger study where diffusion only was measured. So this is the new map of geographic distribution of reservoir methane emissions, where we just only look at diffusive and ebullitive emissions together. And when we do that, we see this really strong relationship between trophic status and methane emission. And so we think that some of those early relationships between latitude and methane emission had more to do with the method that was being used in these different systems than the actual sort of mechanistic link between something like temperature, for example, and methane emission. So here we have over an order of magnitude higher methane emission in eutrophic systems than we do in oligotrophic systems. And we did a lot of linear regressions with each potential predictor variable, and of all of the regressions, Chlorophylla A was by far the best predictor. I'm not showing the plot here, but it was an R-squared of about 0.5. So I'm not really talking about a true carbon budget here. what I'm really talking about is just the surface area flux of methane and carbon dioxide, not an accounting of how much carbon burial is occurring in the reservoir or flooding of the pre-existing landscape and the change. But when we just look at surface emission, we don't see a reversal of the carbon budget with eutrophication. So some people have proposed, in a eutrophic system, you're fixing a lot more carbon through photosynthesis. So potentially that in those systems you could fix more carbon and sort of reverse this heterotrophy that is prevalent throughout aquatic lakes and reservoirs. But only about 15% of our reservoirs were sinks for carbon dioxide. And on a CO2 equivalent basis, this is just a visualization of what I was telling you before, that about 80% of the CO2 equivalent emissions were coming from methane. So these eutrophic systems are contributing significantly more to the CO2 equivalent emissions. And so Karina talked some about some of these negative consequences of eutrophication, and I have toxic algal blooms up there, toxic cyanobacteria. But this emerging picture of eutrophication in reservoirs adds another to the list, which is just this increase in greenhouse gas source in eutrophic ecosystems. So when we think about nutrient management, we can start to think of multiple win-wins for not only reducing toxic algal blooms and some of these low oxygen dead zones, but also potentially reducing greenhouse gas emission as well. So this is the pie chart that I showed you earlier, and now we have a little orange slice there that represents artificial reservoirs. This is our best estimate based on current surface area estimates, and then the emission estimates that I showed you in the previous slides. And it suggests that reservoirs are responsible for about 5% of the global methane budget, which, is a little slice, but it's a significant slice, and something that we could potentially think about managing, because these systems are managed to begin with. The other thing is that these reservoirs are a really dynamic part of our landscape. So this map shows planned and under construction reservoirs across the globe. And if you do some back of the envelope calculations about the average surface area per megawatt emission and then the number of megawatt hours that these reservoirs are going to be adding to the global hydropower grid, this could represent a doubling of reservoir surface area, and these are just reservoirs that produce hydropower. So with the increased variability of the hydrologic cycle, I would think that it would be likely that other types of reservoirs will become more prevalent as well. Of course, there's exceptions. Like if you look at the United States, you'll notice that there's really no points there. We're in a net decommissioning point in the United States, thinking a lot about eco flows and kind of identifying dams that make less sense. But as a global picture, we're continuing to build a lot more hydropower. And the analysis that I talked through just now, also I think it's important to point out that it omitted a number of potentially important alternative pathways for greenhouse gas emission, just because of limited amounts of data. So this gray bar shows the emission estimates that I talked about in the synthesis, but we have these other types of emission, like emissions from drawdown regions of the reservoir, emissions downstream of the reservoir, and then degassing emissions, which can be particularly important in systems where water is withdrawn from the hypolimnion, and you have that stratification cap where you get a lot of methane buildup in the bottom waters. You can have, upwards of 50% of your emission coming from just the water that's being spilled downstream that doesn't have time to kind of interact with those methane consumers, those methanotropes. That's just emitted to the atmosphere. So I think these are pathways that are important to measure more and to better constrain. Another thing that's sort of come out since the synthesis that I think is potentially a really powerful approach is just thinking about when we're comparing controls on methane emission across big geographic gradients, the power of having kind of a shared method. So this is some work that has come out of David Basbeken's lab in Sweden, and it's currently up for discussion on biogeosciences, but they've developed this low-cost methane sensor that kind of makes it a lot more accessible for people with less funding to go out and make these measurements without having to rely on a gas chromatograph or an LGR or some other much higher cost measurement methodology. So takeaway from the global synthesis work, methane sampling method makes a big difference. And we found that age and latitude weren't as powerful predictors of methane emission from reservoirs as was previously thought, but that chlorophyll A and sort of overall ecosystem productivity were really the best predictors. And so this suggests that ecosystem productivity should be considered both when you're planning sites for new reservoirs, but also just in thinking about the potential ecosystem benefits of nutrient management, even in existing watersheds. Okay, so now I'm going to go on and talk a little bit about challenges with upscaling methane emissions, kind of moving forward and thinking about how this reservoir piece fits into the global methane budget. And the challenge, one of the challenges here is that our aquatic ecosystems are just extremely diverse. So these are just some photos of different waterscapes. Just to start thinking about, I think we all tend to think about our local reservoirs or lakes or wetlands, and we kind of use those as our model systems, but there are a lot of different types of systems depending on where we look. And there's also a lot of either completely artificially created or artificially human modified systems. And so the question then becomes, when we go out and sample these systems, how representative is our sample population of the global population of these water bodies? So these are some plots from a synthesis that's in process with Judith Rosentretter leading this effort out of Australia, where she's looking at methane emissions across a number of different aquatic ecosystems. So here we have the systems that kind of have the most number of measurements: streams and rivers, lakes, reservoirs, and estuaries. And the big takeaway here is just that these aren't normally distributed methane emission estimates. So the median is plotted in sort of an orange color, and then the mean is always higher, quite a bit higher. So this is on a log scale. There's this strong right skewed distribution, where if you upscale with a mean estimate, which is arithmetically the correct way to upscale if you believe that your sample population is representative of your global population, you get a much different number than if you upscale with the median. So there's a big disagreement among scientists, a lot of questions about which method should we be using. Up to this point, it's mostly been means, but there's also been some groups that are concerned that we're overestimating. And so one potential way around this is to scale with a predictor variable that's more easily measured, like chlorophyll A. So this was a recent paper by Del Santro and colleagues where they showed that lakes and reservoirs are best, their methane emission is best predicted by chlorophyll A, and that there's not really a relationship with water body surface area. And they developed this relationship, and then they combined this relationship with sort of projections of future nutrient loading to suggest that methane emissions from lakes and reservoirs could increase from anywhere between 30 and 90% over the next century, just due to increases in nutrient loading. So to do this upscaling, they're using this satellite-based data, which is showing a global distribution of chlorophyll A in lakes. But there's a couple challenges here. One is that we don't have information about lake versus reservoir. The other one is that this method is only able to look at lakes that are larger than 1 kilometer squared. And that's a problem because we know that small systems are disproportionately important in terms of their greenhouse gas emission on a per area basis. The other issue is just this question about representative sampling. So this is a plot showing water body size versus methane flux. And it seems that if you squint your eyes, you have higher emission from the smaller systems, just as has been found in other studies. But then you have this weird anomaly, and the question there becomes, are those samples representative of their population or not? And if you look into the literature, these are like Amazon floodplain lakes. So they might not really be the best representation of lakes in that size class in general. So some synthesis work I've been working on more recently is taking a similar data set to the one analyzed before and just asking if lakes and reservoirs are different in terms of their methane emission and also the controls on that emission. This is sort of a conceptual diagram that we built based on another paper looking at lakes and reservoirs in the United States, where we just took, we have this national scale lake survey where we randomly sample lakes across the United States, and we don't differentiate between an artificial and a natural lake. And it turns out in the US about half of the lakes that are randomly sampled are reservoirs, so that gives you an idea of how many reservoirs we have. Even if we're not building more, we have quite a few of them. And what we found is that there's some really different catchment scale and water body scale characteristics of reservoirs than of natural lakes. So they tend to have higher catchment area to surface area ratios. And we can think about this in terms of a higher influx to content ratio, because we didn't see big differences in surface area. So they're generally draining a larger area and receiving more runoff per unit water body size. And they also tend to be less clear than lakes do. So we know they're different in a lot of ways, and so the question then is, are they different with respect to their methane emission and the controls on that emission? So in this synthesis, we asked if predictors of lake methane flux differed significantly from predictors of reservoir flux, and how might that be biasing the way that we're upscaling fluxes from these systems. So here we have a global database that combines the reservoir methane emissions that I talked about in the last talk with some newer estimates, and then also adds in lakes, which are in the red. So we had 220 lake estimates and 89 reservoir estimates, and we excluded systems that had diffusive only. So this is diffusive plus ebullitive emission only. And what we find is that there's actually very few lake methane emission estimates that have been made in tandem with a measurement of chlorophyll A, and that when we look at a relationship between chlorophyll A and methane in natural lakes, the regression is currently insignificant. And if we're just looking at the slope, there's not as steep of a response of methane emission to increased chlorophyll as there is in reservoirs. But surface area is an important predictor. So as previous work had shown, smaller systems tend to emit more. And we can think about this kind of as a combination of organic matter inputs from the littoral zone being higher in smaller systems, and then also in smaller systems you tend to have less water body depth, so you have less of a region for methane to come into contact with methanotrophs and be oxidized before it reaches the surface of the system. So this is our new upscaling estimate for lakes and reservoirs, taking into account this control of water body size and scaling lakes based on water body size. And then we scaled the large reservoirs with that chlorophyll A emission relationship, and then we scaled the small ones just based on a mean emission. And what we get is a number that's similar to previous numbers, but that also is the first estimate that takes into account ice cover. So if we're just looking at aerial emission rates, our aerial emission rates are maybe like 30% higher than any other emission rates that have been reported up to this point, which is probably largely because we only used systems that measured both that diffusive and that bubble pathway. So I think moving forward, we really need more resolved mapping of global water bodies. One of the things that I mentioned before is that we aren't able to differentiate between lakes and reservoirs using satellite data. So we really don't have a good idea of how many global water bodies are artificial, even though we have a bunch of information to suggest that they're functioning differently than natural lakes. And then also just an ability to resolve some of these smallest systems, which sometimes are covered by forested regions. Right now, our best estimates of lake distribution are from this hydrolakes database, but this hydrolakes database, can only resolve down to, I think it's 0.1 kilometer square systems. And it finds that the most small systems are at high latitudes, but we don't know if that's because of a methodological challenge in finding these small systems under forest cover, if it is actually a real thing. And that influences sort of these ice cover corrections that we're using. Just to sort of emphasize the uncertainty here, I just wanted to show you, this is a revised pie chart with Judith's aquatic ecosystem methane emission estimates. This is using mean emissions. So in the mean emission scenario, aquatic systems, which are all of the pie charts other than this gray one, are dominating the global methane emission budget. But if we use medians, that our estimate drops by about 40%. So there's quite a bit of uncertainty there. Moving forward and thinking about how these methane emissions might change in the future, I already talked about nutrient regime and how that could be an important influence on future emission. But also temperature is a big sort of unknown. The paradigm right now is that increasing temperature will lead to increasing methane emission, because the understanding is that methanogens are more sensitive to increase in temperature than methanotrophs. But we have sort of limited measurements that have actually gotten at that process outside of a bottle assay. And some of these microbes have like longer response time. So archaea, they won't respond to something on the order of hours. So some of the work that I'm currently involved in is with a group of all female scientists. We got a National Geographic grant to study methane emissions and methane cycling in Icelandic lakes. And we're using a natural temperature gradient to ask questions about what happens to methane emission as temperature changes. And what we found so far, we've conducted these methane assay bottle experiments, and what we find is that we actually see the highest rates of methane oxidation in the warmest lakes. And this is net methane oxidation. So we put water in a bottle, we incubate it for 24 or 48 hours, and we see a net consumption of methane in the bottle. And these lakes are really different than sort of our typical temperate lake. They're extremely well mixed. Some of them are like 200 feet deep, and they're completely mixed in the middle of the summer because of a combination of high winds and not a lot of tree cover. And so this is sort of a potentially positive story and a reminder that, you know, we need to continue to examine the role of temperature in different lake and reservoir types. So takeaways from the global upscaling: uncertainty regarding representativeness of the sample population suggests that we should really be scaling these emissions with a more easily measured predictor variable. And that predictor variable might differ depending on system type. And also that we need to continue to work on characterizing these predictor variables across a global set of lakes and reservoirs and other aquatic ecosystem types. Okay, so on to identifying opportunities for management. This is another schematic from that lake and reservoir synthesis that I mentioned earlier. And this is just thinking about how lakes and reservoirs likely are responding to climate change in some really different ways. The one I want to talk about today is just this, what we call a management filter, or the potential for management in the system to really change the ultimate outcome of how the system is responding to a climate change driver. And we think that filter is a lot bigger in a reservoir than a lake for a couple of reasons. The primary one just being that in a reservoir, the outflow is managed. It's inherently, there's a dam at the outflow, and we have control sometimes over the depth of water that's withdrawn from the lake, and pretty much always over the volume of water that's released from the lake. We also, so those are site management type actions, but we also have a landscape scale management action, which has to do with where are we choosing to place these reservoirs across a landscape. So first I'll talk about the landscape scale management. So the analysis that I talked through today would really suggest that when we're thinking about placing new reservoirs, and if we're thinking about their role in greenhouse gas emission, we should be placing these systems higher up in watersheds, further away from nutrient inputs that tend to occur lower down in a watershed. And then also that we should be examining just capacity for nutrient management strategies to reduce these emissions. So we would think that this might help, but sometimes the time scale over which that can help can be really, really long. You know, efforts to study the effect of some watershed nutrient management strategies on greenhouse gas emissions would be a good next step. And then consider making artificially constructed ponds deeper so that there's more water column for the methane to be oxidized across, and potentially larger systems as well. This is a nice example that came out recently where a group of Brazilian scientists, actually an international group, but the lead on this was Brazilian, used a national data set of potential proposed dam sites within the Amazon and sort of rated them in terms of their greenhouse gas emission per megawatt hour. So systems that had a larger surface area relative to their depth had much higher emission per megawatt hour than systems that were deeper with less surface area in general. And so they used sort of this information and these estimates of CO2 equivalent emissions per megawatt hour to sort of suggest that we could maximize the systems that we're building in terms of greenhouse gas emission by preferentially selecting these deeper, smaller surface area systems. On a site basis, some work that I did as part of my Ph.D. and some work from a number of other labs has shown that water level can be a really important control on methane emission, particularly methane ebullition, where if you have a large water level drawdown event, you can kind of think of the lake as like a soda can. You've popped the top, and all of this methane that was previously held in solution by pressure is sort of instantaneously released and bypasses this methane oxidation layer in the sediment. And so this was some work we did in a couple of reservoirs in the Klamath Basin, in the sort of Pacific Northwest, Northern California area, where we worked with a hydropower operator to simulate sort of a different hydropeaking regime, where the first couple days we had sort of business as usual. The second 2 days we had excess, drawdown in excess of what normally occurs during a hydropeaking schedule. And then the last couple days were sort of a return to normal. And what you can see is that we have this, large chunk of emission happening on the days where drawdown occurred to a level below normal. And what we think is going on is that was just accessing a pool of methane gas that, was held, like a sort of was in equilibrium and held in solution by pressure, and then when that pressure dropped even further, it was released. And then this is a data set from Lacamas Lake, where we went out and measured methane diffusion and ebullition over multiple years, and sort of compared that to drawdown. And what we saw is that over 95% sometimes of the annual methane budget, of the annual emission, occurred during this month-long period during the annual drawdown for flood control. And so sort of the next step that hasn't been taken, but that I think is a really important question, is about the timing of these drawdowns and how important that is. The drawdown in the system occurs before the lake mixes, where you still have this large methane pool. And so if you waited for the lake to be mixed, how much methane emission could you avoid? Typically we see a pulse in methane emission when a lake or a reservoir mixes, but we also see a big jump in methane consumption in the water column. So not all of the methane that's stored is ultimately released, whereas this drawdown kind of results in this pulse emission effect. And we know that reservoir drawdowns are common and they're widespread. I don't have a good picture of this on a global scale, and I'd be curious to hear anecdotes from your systems, or if you know of European databases where we could look at this. But this is an image from the USGS NWIS database that's just visualizing the number of reservoirs that experience drawdowns, and over 95% of the reservoirs in that database are experiencing at least a half-meter drawdown once a year. So I think this is an important thing to think about. And to think about, the timing of those drawdowns, and if we could be sort of optimizing them to reduce emission. And then I think I would be remiss to not mention that we have to weigh these sort of greenhouse gas management issues in reservoirs against a whole suite of other management issues. And sometimes, the greenhouse gas implications of management aren't the most important thing to be thinking about. So right now I'm working in the Colorado River Basin as part of the Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center. And this case study is one of, over-allocated water supply, where we have major sort of water quantity issues that are sort of first-line priority for thinking about management in this system. So I'm part of an adaptive management group, and that means that there are a number of stakeholders that are involved in the decision-making process for sort of identifying lines of research work in the systems. And this experimentation is kind of thought of as learning by doing, where we have a lot of power to sort of influence the management regime in the system, at least within the bounds of potential operating capacity, and then to look at what effects those different flow experiments have on the river below the dam as well as potentially on Lake Powell. Right now, there's a lot of uncertainty in the greenhouse gas budget associated with Lake Powell. From what we know about methane emission controls, we would think that the system would be a low emitter, but we also don't know a lot about how arid reservoirs work. It's our least well-constrained sort of biome for reservoir greenhouse gas emission. The system is pretty high in sulfate, and it's pretty low productivity, but we also have some measurements from the tributaries that are extremely high. So that's something that's sort of going on in the background. But right now, the main management in the system has to do with sand and beaches in the Colorado River for rafters. This is a picture of high flow experiments that are conducted where we release quite a bit above background in the fall for a 3 or 4 day period. And that's to promote building of beaches. And then there's also a lot of management going on right now to help sort of foster biological resources, in particular the endangered humpback chub. So we have a bug flow experiment going on the past couple of summers where we stop hydropeaking on the weekends. So typically we have hydropeaking every day of the week where we have high flows to match energy demand, and then the flow drops out at night. And that creates these massive tides throughout the system with a lot of questions about implication for the food web and for primary production. But now we have this nice experiment where we can see what happens when we keep the water level steady on the weekend. And the primary sort of mechanism or thought there is that steady water is going to promote food for fish by allowing aquatic invertebrates to lay their eggs at low water and keep those eggs moist and free from desiccation, at least on the weekends. So takeaways from management opportunities, reservoir placement and spill management might affect water body emission, and these are important areas for future research. I saw some work is being done here on pump storage, so I'm excited to hear about what you guys are finding in your systems. And then working with a local dam operator, I think, can be really informative because when we think about these flow experiments, we need to make sure that the experiment is actually kind of within the realm of what can be conducted in a given reservoir system, within the realm of flood control and all the other things that are considered as part of the reasoning for that particular reservoir management scheme. And finally, reservoir greenhouse gas emissions must be weighed against other important ecosystem values. And so final thoughts, I talked a lot about how reservoir construction, eutrophication, and some of these climate change drivers might be affecting methane emission. And so I think these are all sort of important and overlapping change pieces that need to be considered when we think about the role of these systems in the carbon budget moving forward. And with that, I'd like to thank a bunch of folks that have helped me along the way, including my Ph.D. advisor, John Harrison, and my current postdoc advisor, Charles Kulik, as well as a number of really awesome peer collaborators. And with that, take questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting analysis of the data, and I would have some questions, but maybe you have questions which are more important than mine are. Yes, please.
Actually, I have two questions. First one might be a little bit off topic. So you showed this pie diagram about the methane emissions of the different sectors. And I wonder if in the sector for sea emissions, there's also this methane, storages which are under pressure below the sea. Are they included in that pie diagram, or do you know something about that?
Yeah, that's a big hot topic, is like these pools of methane in the ocean, these methane clathorates, and whether or not there's capacity for them to be released to the atmosphere and the water column in the future, just as the temperature of the ocean changes. And that's not included in this diagram. So this diagram is showing current emission sources. And that clathrate pool can be thought of, as a pool, a stored pool. I think there's a lot of uncertainty around, like, in the future if that will, like, to what extent that will be important. And so it's not, it's not included in this, I guess is the short answer.
So my second question is also about this pie diagram. So there's, I think in the other one you showed it was like nearly 1/4 from natural, from freshwater. The one before, yeah. So is there research about just capturing this methane that is coming from these natural lakes, or in summary with the reservoirs, it's even nearly half.
Mm-hmm.
So are there intentions about just capturing it? Because then the greenhouse gas emissions for these hydraulic power stations would be better, because then you can even use it as an energy source.
I know there's some groups that have worked on sort of blueprints and engineering ideas for doing exactly what you're saying, capturing methane, especially in more eutrophic systems, more stratified systems where you get this huge buildup of methane in the bottom water and using it as an energy source. So, converting it from methane to CO2, which is 34 times less potent on, the 100-year time horizon. I'm not aware of actual projects that have moved forward, and I imagine that's just cost of, infrastructure and implementation maybe exceeds the demand for that kind of thing. But it'll be interesting to see moving forward if that starts to gain some traction.
So a third question about that. So you showed a lot of methods how to measure and how to influence. So where do you see the best chance, like, to reduce these methane emissions, just to, for example, manage better this spill?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know the exact.
I think, timing of spill is a big deal, and we should be looking into that more and finding systems where we have some flexibility for the timing of spill, where we could, like the system I worked in for my Ph.D., if we waited like 3 additional weeks, I think there'd be quite a bit less methane emission associated with a spill after the reservoir had mixed. But then also the height of spill seems like a big opportunity, and people are, selective withdrawal is already sort of an engineering solution that's being used for temperature control, where you can draw from different layers of the reservoir depending on what kind of temperature regime you want downstream. So I think moving towards using that to reduce downstream methane emission could be, quite a meaningful way to reduce emission. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions, please?
Thanks for your presentation. I was just surprised. I was not aware of how important it is, in case of lakes and reservoirs to the global warming. But I just have more basic question, is that you are suggesting some solutions and they are being done researches, but practically are government taking this seriously or doing some practical actions to stop this, or for example taking some measurements not to make any more artificial reservoirs? And why we are doing this if it makes this amount of changes for global warming? Or what are the practical things that governments are taking into actions?
Yeah.
If we are
Well, I guess I didn't talk about this in this talk, but to put it into context, a lot of reservoirs are still emitting much less emission per megawatt hour than like the natural gas coal-fired power plant. So this is just looking at methane budget and not overall greenhouse gas budget when we look at these pie charts. But yeah, I think the global community is starting to take notice of this. So I felt lucky to be involved in writing the IPCC methodology. So for the first time this past year, methodology for estimating reservoir emission is now included in the national inventory process. So all nations will now be required to estimate reservoir methane emission when they estimate their country greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that's a really important step towards starting to get this on the agenda of policymakers and starting to make it part of how we think about our country's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. And then in the United States, I'm involved with a colleague at the Environmental Protection Agency who is conducting a national reservoir survey, and that's funded by the U.S. government. And it's tagging along sort of to this national lake and reservoir survey that I talked about in my talk, where we're going to subsample the nation's lakes and reservoirs for methane emission and do sort of an intensive campaign that includes funnel traps and diffusive emission estimates. So that's encouraging that the government seems to be taking it seriously enough where they want more sort of national scale information in the U.S.
Any other comments or questions, please?
Yeah, thanks again for your presentation. I was wondering, you mentioned that in locating the dams, it's better to have them larger and deeper, but also it's better to have them in higher levels of watersheds, so they don't have nutrients which produce methane. So which one is more important? Because I assume that if we want bigger and deeper reservoir or artificial lakes, then we have to go down the stream more. So which one do you think is more important to consider, or which one has a bigger impact?
I think it's probably, this isn't a very satisfying answer, but I think it's probably somewhat like watershed case specific. And I know watersheds like the Klamath Basin where there's a bunch of nutrients high up in the watershed, for example. But from my research, I would think nutrients are a more important driver.
But I'm wondering whether this is contradictory, because I guess if you want to have a deep reservoir, you would go up the hills, because there you have the deep valleys. And the further you go down, the larger is the surface area. And this is exactly what you said, where it's not a good proportion, large area and less deep reservoir. So I think it's going in the same direction, going upstream to have less nutrients and also have a deeper reservoir. So I don't think that you have the choice between, it's anyway coming together. Maybe not for 100% of the reservoirs, but for the majority. So I would have a question. So you make a distinguish between the lakes, the natural lakes, and the reservoirs and the emissions in methane, and the size of the catchment, which is, first I thought, oh, why is that larger? But in principle it's obvious, because you have this artificial influence, man-made, and you collect all the water from all over, so this is the intention, to build a reservoir to catch a large area. So then it's clear that the catchment is large, which also brings more nutrients because you have more influenced area. But I'm wondering whether the increase or the higher emission of methane also comes from the system itself. So lakes are old water bodies, so it means there is no nutrients naturally in there, like trees or leaves or so. But in the reservoir there is a pre-vegetation, which you impound them. I guess this would have an influence. So do you think that these things have a more important reason or more important impact or higher impact compared to the natural lakes? And could you see a change over the years? I would expect there's a change over the years. The older the reservoir, the less is the methane emission.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can see nice examples of change over time with methane emissions. So the current IPCC methodology breaks out reservoirs that are less than 20 years old from reservoirs that are more than 20 years old. I think to some degree that's an oversimplification, because in some systems, like in Lacamas Lake, that's a pretty old reservoir, but the water level regime is leading it to be this huge methane source. So I think, it's an overlay of the organic matter and how young the reservoir is, but also its location in the watershed, how it's managed, water level regime, those kind of things.
Is there any more questions? Yes, please.
Hi, thanks for a nice talk. You mentioned the uncertainties in the global budget, and I see, especially with the ebullition, the highest uncertainties. And what do you think, how far, to which extent these estimates are biased by the methodology the researchers use at the moment? So typically you go, or to explain this in more detail, typically go to places where you really can measure ebullition. So you're not going to places where you don't measure because you do not get a result. So can you make an estimate how much this deviation is related to the scheme researchers have in their mind?
I mean, I think that would be an interesting potential overlap for social scientists to come in and survey and talk to people who study this. This is at the crux of the argument between using the median and a mean emission and how we do that. I know for me, in my system, I had never noticed bubbles in Lacamas Lake, and it was an undergrad project. This really awesome woman, Maria, built these methane funnel traps, and I remember having nightmares that we weren't going to catch any bubbles. So in my case, that wasn't true, but it makes sense that in other cases, people see bubbles and they want to measure them. So I don't know, but it's definitely an unresolved issue.
Please.
Just one thing, maybe another question. That you showed that with this also paper with the open science with it for the method for the flux chambers, for example, that they are developing from the civilian in the lab. So when I was looking at now all the papers in the greenhouse gas emissions with the measuring, particularly with the flux chambers, so all of them use some open source software, but what is missing is that most of them use the chambers or buckets from a hardware store that they put it there with unknown weight, and that either impedes through the water, affecting the turbulence and affecting directly to measurements, of course. So, and I think that it could also be some standardization of what you use there. I don't know what you use there, but in general, it's always different.
Yeah, well, and that's what's nice about that paper I showed with the low cost sensor, just sort of standardizing our methods. I do think is important, and also papers that have done methodological comparisons. So there's a nice paper, I think by Zhao, on Three Gorges Reservoir, where they measured emission using a bunch of different types of floating chamber. So the one we're using for this EPA survey is one that was written up in that paper and compared to other methods. But I think, a measurement, an uncertain measurement is better than no measurement at all, and sometimes budgets are an issue. But yeah, this is a nice example of a lower budget approach that it would be comparable to other studies.
But in this case, when you're using different methodology and they're giving different answers, how can you compare different countries, or how can countries can declare that this is the amount of emission when the different methodology gives you different answers? I mean, I know that there are paper researchers comparing these methodologies, but how can we compare them?
Yeah, it's a big problem in the field, and there are papers suggesting. There's a nice paper by Wick where they went out and looked at, depending on how resolved your sampling was, both spatially and temporally, how where you fell on a distribution of emission estimates. And that paper was actually showing that we tend to underestimate emission if we don't sample as much, although there are others that have argued kind of the opposite. But a takeaway was we need to be measuring at least 11 sites for at least like 50 independent sampling measurements, so that's a lot of work. And yeah, there's definitely a trade-off between like measuring emission really well in one system versus trying to look like across a regional scale.
Okay. Is there any more comments or questions? If not, then thank you very much again, Bridget.